Hey folks, David Stewart here. Here's a really common criticism that exists in the metal community of certain records. It's overproduced. And at first thought, that seems like a rather incoherent criticism of something. How can something sound too good? How could you have spent too much time producing it and making it perfect? Outside of some very specific kinds of genres like black metal that have a history of low production value, and that's supposed to add to the atmosphere, there is a much deeper core sentiment that's attached to that really can be expressed in almost every genre in metal, and that is the idea of soul in the game. That if you are going to round off all the corners, if you're going to polish off all the rough edges, you're taking something away from the product that's somewhat intangible and related to the artistry of it. And this sentiment is not limited to heavy metal. Before it, jazz had a lot of the same sentiments, and jazz in particular, because it's based so heavily on improvisation. If things sounded too canned, if it sounded like the solo was practiced note for note, it would seem kind of objectionable to a lot of jazz fans. They wanted things to feel spontaneous, and that meant leaving wrong notes on the record. If you listen to old Miles Davis records, there's a bunch of clams. Even John Coltrane, there's a bunch of pops and squeaks and little mistakes here and there that exist on the record. And that's accepted as part of the cost of producing that spontaneous artistry and that passion that's existing in that moment. So in metal, that sentiment also exists kind of in production value. So if you were to compare, say, a modern Dark Throne record like the Underground Resistance, which has fairly low production value, but gains something from its low production value in that you can hear the song being very close to the moments of conception of the song. The song is not so thoroughly rehearsed that it loses the passion behind the song, and there's the meaning that tends to be imparted into every single note when you're first crafting something. There's more passion attached to what they're doing in pretty much in all their records, but in their later records, which use a lot of different genre influences besides just black metal. They have doom metal influences, power metal influences. The Underground Resistance, which I mentioned, has a lot of early Halloween feelings to it, and if you go and listen to early Halloween records like Walls of Jericho and their Halloween EP, the early stuff, it's pretty low production value. It's very rough, but there's an energy and like an extreme passion to it that can't be really separated from that low production value. Because there's less of a barrier, because there's less rehearsal, there's less takes, you're not doing all the instruments separately, you get a more encapsulated in full artistic expression of what's going on. And I can give you another example in metal to listen to. If you go and listen to the original Sonata Arctica debut album, Ecliptica, and this is actually one of my favorite power metal albums out there. It's a great album. It's full of really catchy songs, but there's rough edges in it. There's, little things that are slightly out of time. The tempo changes in songs because it wasn't done with a click track, and everyone on the record was young at the time. So maybe there's even some compositional things that you might do differently. They actually went and re-recorded that album years later with most of the personnel being different. And you go and you listen to the re-recorded version, which is done with a click track, and they dropped the tuning. It sounds, in my opinion, awful. I can't stand the Ecliptica re-recording. It's one of the worst ideas I've really heard sort of executed on tape. And the thing is that the studio albums that sort of surround that record aren't bad, and certainly are nowhere near as bad sounding as this reissue of Ecliptica. But what happened? Well, what happened is you took away all those little elements, all the things that kind of lent that emotional feeling to Ecliptica, the real passion behind Kako's voice and everything that was just ended up on that tape, including mistakes, little mistakes here and there that you can never get everything completely perfect. But if you are really trying to, and you're able to do that, then what you sacrifice is some of the emotion that happens in the moment. Now, I can also, going on with the music analogies, I could tell you as a classical guitarist, you never have a perfect performance, and I've had performances where I didn't miss any notes, and I always felt kind of worse about those performances where I was really on technically than the performances where I maybe missed a note or two, or missed a couple notes, or messed something up, or even had maybe big mistakes. But I felt much more into the music and much more passionate, and getting responses from my audience, that seems to be a pretty similar sentiment as well. I've seen Elliot Fisk perform in a very technical manner that people found really boring and actually thought was bad. And then I've seen him come out on stage and just rip it up and really attack his guitar and play with passion. And there's a lot more mistakes. Like you hear the cracking of the strings on the guitar. He makes a buzz when he just is attacking the bass notes. Whenever he's playing something, there's a crack to it. There's a buzz that happens. And even though that would be considered a negative thing to most classical guitarists, it enhances the product of his performance because there's so much extra oomph put into what he's doing. And I used to get criticisms that I used to break my bass notes on my guitar because I would attack it so hard. In fact, my old teacher, Juan Serrano, was like, David, you play like monster. And I'd be like, thank you. And he says, it's not a compliment. It's not a compliment. You're too into what you're doing, and you're not thinking about the total package. So you can, I guess, go too far the other way. But just to make that whole point a little bit clearer, if you try to make everything polished as a musician, sometimes you're going to lose that almost imperceptible truth to what you're doing. And sometimes the records that don't have the best production end up having the biggest impact on what you're doing. In fact, Master of Puppets, another great example. There's during the guitar solo, there's a mistake that they left on the record because it was so weird. And there's this pinch harmonic that Kirk Hammett does in the solo for Master of Puppets that just screams really high, like the string like touched the pickup, the neck, the front pickup, the neck pickup, and just ended up pulling out this super high harmonic, and he kind of went with it and continued the take. And they thought it was so cool and so spontaneous and so energetic, they left it on the tape. And not just that, but all the following takes that Kirk Hammett tried to do of that solo, he could never replicate that sound properly. So they left the original take in, even though it had a lot more rough edges, because it was much more pure to like the passion of what Kirk was doing for that particular song. So another great example for music. Now, let's go over to the other thing I always talk about, which is literature. Can you have literature that's too polished? Literature, you can look at it really from both sides when it comes to soul in the game. If you are creating a product that you're writing for market, my hope is that you're going to really care about that product and that it's going to be something that you really enjoy. There's a danger to, I put out a lot of content like, here's how you write a book, here's how you plot something, here's these phases of creation. I recommend you write so many thousands of words a day. And the process, it's great to think about things as a process, but sometimes efficiency is not always efficient. And if you do things exactly the method that someone else says to do, and you don't give yourself any room for that artistic expression, for that spontaneity, then you may find that your product will be a little bit lacking in the end. So whenever I, for instance, plan a book, I plan the big elements of plot. I rarely go scene by scene. I went scene by scene for another book I planned very recently, which I was going to share with my patrons, but I'm going to share them a different plan because that book's going to end up coming out under a pen name. But when I plan a book, usually I plan the big events, what's going to happen, where the changes of direction are happening. Then I allow myself a lot of freedom when I'm actually drafting the manuscript to do things that come to me in that moment and to really express them that way. And it comes out a lot more natural. It's a lot more fun to write. And yes, maybe during the editing you catch more lines of dialogue that are a little hokey or something like that. But the point is that you leave on the page, in your first draft in particular, all your soul. You don't want to leave your soul out of the game for the drafting phase. It's better to go back and be critical to yourself in the editing phase and have a really passionate product than it is to have something that's completely by the numbers and ends up being boring or uninteresting to you as an artist while you're producing it or afterwards. Certainly what I feel like readers really connect with are not these big executions, which I think are mandatory to have a successful book. How you manage the plot details, how you manage the big conflict. But what they really attach themselves to are these moments in the book, these scenes that have a big impact, where a really important line is spoken. Thinking about your favorite movies too. There's these lines that you remember, and you tend to forget most of the other lines that are less inspired. There's a great example in Empire Strikes Back from Star Wars. Originally, there's this part where Harrison Ford, his character Han Solo, is being lowered into this machine that's going to freeze him in carbonite. And what was written was, she says, "I love you." She finally tells him that she loves him, which is something that was set up in the exposition at the very beginning of the movie, where Harrison Ford is like, "You like me and stuff," and she's like, "Nah." And there's a bunch of dialogue to that in the very beginning of the movie. She finally says, "I love you," and originally he was supposed to say, "I love you too." And they did a bunch of takes of it, and he just decided to change it, and so he said, "I know." And that's the one that ended up on the tape. That's the one that ended up on film because of that extra little bit of soul, that extra little thing that Harrison Ford added into the film that made the character come alive just enough to make it have a highly impactful moment. And that tends to be one of the moments that people really remember from Empire Strikes Back. And Empire Strikes Back, I think it's fondly remembered because it had so many of those individual moments that were just full of soul and very, very well executed. Even though some of the bigger things, and I'll talk about this when I do an analysis of Empire Strikes Back, some of the bigger things with plot are just are kind of thin in a lot of places. That's not what people really remember. They don't remember that there wasn't like a super strong conflict running through the movie. What they tend to remember is the things that Yoda said to Luke, and the things that Han said to Leia, and the things that Vader and the Emperor talked about, and the way that Darth Vader acted towards his subordinates. They remember these moments and the high impact that those have. So that has to do with those moments of soul. And definitely when you're writing, you want to allow yourself to have those. At the very worst, you rewrite them during the editing process, but chances are you're going to want to keep some of those ideas that come to you because they're spontaneous, because they have that soul element to them. So having your soul in the game, having leaving yourself allowance to spontaneously create those things that are have meaning in the moment that you're creating them, I think is a really good strategy. And of course, that would apply to visual art as well. Painters tend to plan their paintings, and if you're painting and then you come up with this idea that or maybe you even make a mistake and the subject's expression, like let's say you're painting a portrait and their eyebrows just slightly off from where you originally planned it, but you see it and it adds another dimension, you a lot of times you'll go with it. So artists will do this too, as you're filling in the details. A lot of those details come from that moment and kind of supporting the emotion of what you want when you're drafting a particular piece. So allow yourself to keep soul in the game. As soon as you make it too much of a product, going back to the metal thing, as soon as you make it too much of a product, the audience can perceive that it's too much of a product and can actually reject it a little bit. If it's so highly polished that it sounds flawless and flat and without emotion, then people don't have that connection at all. And I think actually newer Star Wars movies are probably a great example of that. The Last Jedi is very well produced. The production values are quite high. The visual design is excellent. The special effects are great. The sound design was, I assume, really, really great. But it had no soul in the game, right? It was just a product. And none of the actors were really committed except for Mark Hamill, who I think was rather dejected about the decisions for his character, and you can kind of see it in his face. No one had any soul in the game. It was just a complete corporate product. And there's other movies, plenty of movies that you can watch that really feel like that. A lot of the Marvel movies feel so streamlined into this Marvel movie format that it feels like too overproduced. It feels overproduced. It's too much of a product. It's too generated to be an object for itself rather than an actual artistic expression, which is why people don't tend to have a lot of connection with those movies, even if they enjoy special effects and those spectacular kinds of events. I think a lot of audience members, if you ask them to list their favorite movies, they're going to list those that have more soul in the game. I think about like the movie Ronin. I felt had a lot of soul in the game. There was everyone that was involved in the production of it was super interested in doing a great job. And you can hear this in classic metal records. One of the things, if you listen to Ronnie James Dio's first solo record, Holy Diver, everyone that was on that record will talk about how committed everyone in that band was to producing the best record possible and how excited they were to make the music that they were making. You can hear it on the record. It comes out great. It's definitely one of the all-time great records. And you can hear that on tape with many, many different people. good production value does not necessarily mean no soul in the game, but it has to do with the way that you approach what you're doing and the way you approach production. Is that if you're trying to file off all the rough edges and make it absolutely perfect, sometimes you can leave a little bit of that momentary passion behind that makes things really tend to stick with people. And there's a lot of very, very difficult things to communicate in a flawless take, like the dynamics of your voice, the way it happens to crackle when you push yourself too much, the fact that you may play with rubato more than with a click track. All of those things tend to get stripped away when you do highly produced recording, and it's going to be the same thing with movies. And it honestly could be the same way with books as well. If you're really doing it by the book, and you're just kind of writing by numbers, the product that comes out at the other end is going to feel like a product that's written to market a little too much. You always want to leave your thumbprint on it and leave yourself lots of room to do what you want to do as an artist. So that's my thought on it. Efficiency is not always efficient. You got to have your soul in the game, and it's pretty apparent when you hear a product that doesn't. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time, and have a great day.